Ne radim. Ne vidite.
Maybe it's here at some time.
Dobro večer, draga publiko. Na redu je posljednji događaj predposljednjega dana festivala. Burhan Sönmez je s nama, kurdski pisac i predsjednik Međunarodnog PEN centra. On predstavlja svoj roman Kamen i sjenka, a s njim razgovara vrlo rado viđen gost Bukstana, John Freeman. Uživajte u razgovoru, a potpisivanje knjige bit će u knjižari nakon događaja.
Thank you for that. Thank you for coming tonight, everyone. It's my huge honor to present BURHAN SÖNMEZ to you tonight, who is going to be premiering his new book, Stone and Shadow, which is his fifth novel. There's some things that are worth saying about him before we begin. Over 5 novels over the last 10 plus years, I think BURHAN SÖNMEZ has created a metaphysical map for existence in the lives of his characters. From this book, Stone and Shadow, which is a novel really about what happens when love can traverse time and how love interacts with our souls over 7 decades of the characters' lives in this book, to this short book, Sins and Innocence, which was his first book published in English, which is the story of 2 exiles who meet in Cambridge, an Iranian and a Kurdish Turkish man, and how they are trying to tell each other stories about where they're from when they cannot go back to where they're from. In that novel, which takes place partly in a graveyard, the one character says to the other, I think we know where our home is when we know where we want to be buried. And in this novel, Stone and Shadow, I think one of the characters discovers that you know what home is when you know whose name you want to say for the end of time. So it's a deeply romantic and beautiful book. And you can see he's just overflowing with romantic passion. He was born in a small village in central Anatolia, with no electricity, where he grew up with storytelling all around him from his grandmother and his mother. He came to Istanbul when he was just 17 to study law and became a lawyer and worked on behalf of people for justice. As this got him to some degree into trouble, which we'll talk about later. Like almost every Turkish writer I've ever met, he spent time in prison for doing things, although we will also talk about that. And then for reasons we will also later talk about having to do with an altercation with police, he had to leave Turkey and came to Britain for rehabilitation. And there he solved insomnia in the most strange way I've ever heard. He started to write novels. He stayed up late at night and started to write. This former lawyer who always also wanted to be a poet spent several years writing his first book. Among the ones I've mentioned, Stone and Shadow, and Sins and Innocence, he's also the author of Istanbul, Istanbul, which is a beautiful, warm, and sometimes even very funny novel about several men who share a very small cell in a prison 3 floors underground, and the stories that they tell to each other and the ways they give each other comfort as they have no idea what's going to happen to them. You who are here tonight might also know him by the novel Labyrinth, in which a man tries to kill himself, a blues singer, by jumping several hundred feet into the Bosphorus, where he awakens with no memory but a realization that the Ottoman Empire has ended, and that he needs to find his way in the world. So it's a wondrous group of books that he has written. And they all have an amazing effect that is both emotional and mist-like, but is also deeply interesting and intellectual. So please join me in welcoming BURHAN SÖNMEZ. Sorry for that rambling introduction, but I find your work could talk us in many circles. And Stone and Shadow, like a lot of your books, kind of moves in elliptical patterns. It begins in 1984 in a cemetery. Avdo, who's a grave engraver, has just got an assignment to make a gravestone for a man who has had 7 names over his entire life. And he knows that this man needs an exceptional gravestone, and so he begins to make this. And as he does, a police officer wanders in looking for a girl who later turns up, and thus begins our story. I wonder if you could tell a little bit about why this book moves in the way it does, going forward and back in time, grabbing elements from history and not, and telling the lives of so many characters who have so many different names.
Thank you, John. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming. You know, now we live in a world, we would like to see things in unity, try to grab the meaning of things, you know, single meaning in everything. And on the other hand, we feel that it's impossible because everything is fragmented, everything is dissolving. And in this story, when I wanted to portray a man, an old man, and telling his story starting from his childhood, that means about 80 years, and that means the whole 20th century of Turkey and Middle East, I thought that I cannot picture it as a unity. It should be designed in fragmentation. And then I started to pick up the idea of cubist painting. You know, they can take something, then they chop. They don't divide, they chop everything, like Guernica by Picasso. And then they spread everything on that, you know, canvas or on table, but still you get the meaning of unity, even though everything is chopped, you know, disintegrated and far away from each other, or each part. But that also gives us this chance. In this world, our conscience and our mind has limited dimensions. You know, in painting, we see things in 3 dimensions, you know, and sometimes depth. But we cannot see the back of, you know, that object on painting. Or similarly in life. I know you, you know me. How much? How can we know other people? So in this story, I said, okay, I have to cut everything. I have to chop everything, because that's also a reflection of the psychology of my protagonist. His life is, you know, very much disturbed in every way. Of course, at the center always there's love. We follow a love story. And if we follow love, maybe it will be more helpful for us to understand the unity that we lost or we long for.
Avdo, tell me a little bit about him. He's a master grave maker. We watch him over his whole life. You mentioned he has a love story. What else do you think the reader should know about him as they follow him in the world?
When I was little, my mom would always tell us stories of people who are looking for love but never reached out that point. They couldn't find that because their stories were more attractive than those successful, you know, love stories. And she knew that if we follow up the story of those people and try to understand their pain, maybe we will prepare ourselves for the future. That's the sense, maybe. This is what I thought through her. And with Avdo, I wanted to understand the feeling of my mother, why she told these stories in that way, and how it helps her, me, and people like me to understand life better. Because Avdo has one single thing in his life, to find the love through a woman he fell in love with, and also through mother he has never seen, because he is a lost kid.
He's an orphan, yes.
Yeah, he's an orphan. So looking for two women in his life. One is lost mother and lost lover, becomes center of his story. Then we can interpret it, of course, in allegoric way. Maybe it's the feeling of looking for your lost nation, your lost country, your lost climate. Because at the first chapter, you may remember, his dog, because his best friend is his dog. His dog is killed by policemen. And so losing his best friend as an animal, there also a sense of giving. We are surrounded by a bigger world than people, human being. All this nature we are losing now, we don't show much interest in it, but we have to be aware of it, more.
Yeah, Burnham's books have such a wonderful way of living within compressed spaces. I mentioned the book set in prison. This is set in a graveyard. And other books are moving within spaces that are pressurized. And the graveyard where Avdo lives, works, practices his craft is both endless and not. There's lots of restrictions to it. And I wonder if you can talk about bringing the non-human into a novel in the sense that novels are typically about people, and you have a tree at the center of this. You have a lot of elements in this book, water and fire, and they move throughout the book in this lovely harmonic way. And it feels like a new movement within your work. And I wonder if you could talk about that and maybe say something about what brought it about.
When I grew up in my village, I didn't notice that it was a different place than other places I was going to see. In the village, the design of a village, at the center there is cemetery. Cemetery is not somewhere surrounded with a wall that you can visit only on certain days. It is part of your daily life. You go through that, okay? You just say hello every night. It's very much, kind of tradition. When you pass by a grave, you always say good night. This is typical village life. And everything is in the village, Wolves would come down, foxes would come. But then we moved town. Maybe one of the first things that struck me in town that we couldn't see dead people anymore. Because we, I think, try to forget about them. Okay, dead people are dead. We are living one. That pride, something positive and negative at the same time. So in my novels, I try to bring all unity by including the dead. We are people, animals, nature, but also dead people with us, always. When we were just talking about the political situation in Bosnia currently, but then I realized that we've been talking about the politics of that generation, because they are what they did is now designing what we are doing now. And this unity, so widening it, expanding it towards the meaning of that and giving a positive sense. Because when we talk about that, usually we feel anxious, or it is something we should be aware of, okay? Because it's something very bad. But if we give a positive color to it, then we can see that it is something to help us to understand life better.
I use the word metaphysical rather than religious because I think that more accurately describes what sort of cosmological questions you're asking in this book. But, in Islam, the idea is that we live in an aggregate of visible and invisible things. In Arabic, it's al-ghaib, the unseen. And, there are ways that things can be not here. It's absence, as in by death or by sort of estrangement. There's the unknown, hidden. And then there's the future, which we cannot know as well. And I just used the word harmonic to describe your book because it does move in musical ways, and there's a prelude, and you come back to themes and to events. But there is also this almost spiritual question of how to live in a world of knowing and unknowing. And you've been talking about the living and the dead, but can you talk a little bit more about the unseen and the seen and how that operates in a novel that's this vast, which is not just telling the story of a man and his quest for love and to reconnect with that love, which cannot be done until he dies, but also a man living across time in a nation which is being formed and shaped and broken down and reshaped. How do the unseen and seen things sort of orchestrate the novel in that way?
I was a human rights lawyer. Of course, I was a book lover. Book always been at the center of my life. Reading and writing poetry. But being active in human rights law was something covering my whole daily life. And then something happened. I had problems with Turkish authorities. Oh, they had problem with me. Then I ended up going to exile. I was in a very bad shape physically. I was heavily wounded. I was about to die, and all these parts are gone. And when I was leaving country, I was a middle-aged man. I thought that I will never be able to come back home anymore. I went to my mother. I didn't tell her anything. I said, "Mom, I'm going to abroad again for some meetings. This time I will stay a bit longer, but then I will come back." She said, "Okay, son, that's fine." Usually I stay 1 or 2 days with my mother. And that time I said, "Mom, I will stay a bit longer, about 10 days. She said, "Oh, that's good." And she said, "Are you okay with your head? Do you still have those headaches, that kind of things?" Then I said, "Can we do something?" And I said, "I want you to tell me the whole stories you told me when I was little in Kurdish stories, and then I will record everything on that old-fashioned cassette tapes, because we didn't have all these, smart gadgets yet." And I put all these cassette tapes. For 7 nights, she told me everything, and I recorded. Then I went UK. I was a political refugee there, and I was receiving treatment. I was listening to her stories every night, and then I started to find a graveyard that I want to be buried in Cambridge, because I was there, because there was no chance to go back home anymore. I was also sentenced to some term in prison. And in the end, I found a beautiful graveyard where Wittgenstein is buried. And after 10, 15 years, I said, what was wrong with me? Why I was always going to graveyards and looking for a nice place to be buried? I think that was a sense of finding a homeland. This is now my interpretation. I wanted to have a home. The home was nowhere anymore. That's beautiful opening in a story. I'm looking for, or I miss my home, but I don't know where it is. And I think I found it in a graveyard at that moment. And of course, then I recovered. After 10 years, I've written books, and I started to see things, the world and myself, from a different angle. And but when I was writing, especially this book, I said, this state of mind was something special for me at that time, but it is maybe something common for some people in many places. So I transform it to that story of that guy, who is living in a cemetery, and also doing things. About this cemetery, I have to give, if you know Istanbul, Istanbul is a beautiful city, and also it has beautiful cemeteries, but this one, small Merkez Efendi cemetery, is not known very much, it's very small. The reason I picked it up, because its history is very interesting. It's, in the past, in the longer past, it was Byzantine, a Roman area. There was something established by Romans, and then Ottoman Sufis came. And another reason, when I was studying at the university, our student dormitory just next to there, it was after military coup, and we were talking about, with friends, we would say, if police come after us, if we need to run away, this is one of the best directions to run. Go in cemetery, dead people will save you. And of course, it didn't save me. I was arrested when I was 19 years old, during military coup. But in the first chapter, when I opened that scene, old man living in the cemetery, and in the middle of night, a young girl comes in. She is running away from policemen. This is something happened and still happening in many places.
Yeah, this pattern of running away from policemen happens throughout the book. I mean, Avdo is running away from policemen when he's, basically ends up getting arrested and goes off to prison. And years later, he's in a cemetery in Istanbul, and a woman who, this does not give anything away, actually, is his niece, turns up, and he sort of takes her in. One thing I want to talk to you about on the back of this very moving description of the last 20 years of your life. Across Stone and Shadow, hospitality is an incredible, important activity. Avdo, when he is in his cemetery and is approached by a police officer, someone who he should not trust from the beginning, his first instinct is to offer the man tea. When this girl shows up not much later, he offers her soup. And throughout the book, in circumstances where people have very little to offer, they're constantly giving each other forms of hospitality. And I wonder, if there's anything that you can say about that beyond just obvious good manners, that when a stranger comes to you, you offer them either something to drink or something to eat. But it feels like it's working in opposition to many of the machinist engines of history and politics in this book, which are the exact opposite of hospitality.
It's in Holy Book, it says, love your neighbor. Where, I don't remember where it was saying, love your enemy. I think we should improve something within our heart, that we have love for everyone, even for enemy. Because in everything, even in evil, in Satan, we should be able to manage to find something beautiful for the future of, humanity.
Do you struggle with that, though?
Yes, of course, psychologically, I'm struggling a lot. Let me tell you two small stories. One is when Nelson Mandela was released from prison. He had been in prison for 27 or 28 years, and so many people started to call him across the world, political leaders. At the time, I think it was Bill Clinton. He was a senator, not president yet. He rang him up, and they talked on the phone, and then Bill Clinton said, I'd like to tell you something. Other day on the newspaper, I read that you are saying, I don't hate those people who put me in prison and tortured me. I understand this is a political statement, but as a human being, you must have different feelings. He says, no, no. This is my real feeling. If I hate them, that means that I am like them. The difference between us and others, are not that we are presenting the right thing, but we are also something different. Is it possible? I just told you, when I was first arrested, I was 19 years old. It was just the darkest period of military coup. I was in that famous torture center in Istanbul. You are being tortured 8 hours a day. If you are a special case, of course, it's longer, 10, 15 hours or 24 hours sometimes. By torture, you know, electric shock, crucifixion, blood. We were in small cells, and we had ways of communicating with each other. Just ticking on the wall, 1, 2, 3, 4, or from the opposite cells, you should write in the air. You know, that kind of ways of communication. And then someday, some people from different cells said that when I was in a torture chamber, I heard that a torturer was on the phone talking with his wife, and their little kid didn't return from school. And they are crying. They think that their child was kidnapped by militants. And for days, we every day worried about that man's child. That guy torturing us, killing us, many people murdered there. And our worry was about that guy and his wife's little kid. This is something we should keep alive. Otherwise, we would be a reflection of torture. We are not reflection. We are something different. So within this book, you know, with these characteristics, maybe art is something to reproduce the ideal man. You know, in philosophy, in metaphysical world, of course, we have great theories, but in art, in novels especially, we need this reproduction again, because today in current political environment, in many places, we are losing that need, that power.
The police officer you write about in this book, his name is Lieutenant Cobra, who shows up in the first scene, accepts the soup and then kills Toteve, Avdo's dog, and then continues to chase Rehan, his niece, throughout the rest of the book. Does many other terrible things, but you give him a dead sister that he won't accept as dead, and so he keeps talking to her. And even the people that work for him, his henchmen, are worried about his sanity because he seems to still be talking to her. And at some point he comes to the graveyard, and you have this unbelievably sad monologue of him talking to her grave, confessing to things that he did. And I wonder, as a person who's lived under the terrible consequences of violence, you know, it's one thing to say what you just said, but to write that must have taken quite a bit out of you, to see into his soul and to let him be both terrible and vulnerable at the same time.
Yeah. I think life is, in totality, is act of re-educating our spirit. I am something now today here. Tomorrow morning I will be something new. Not another person, but something new. How can I make it better and more beautiful, you know, in form and in content? By helping people we don't know, by giving a homeless person something they need on that day, and saving an animal. This is not all religious discourse. Okay, be good and be helpful, give from your heart. This is something actual we are doing now. You know, I'm involved with PEN International, the world's writers' organization. At Penn International, we help writers at risk. That means in difficulty. Every case, we call them case, unfortunately, by the name. For the case of Salman Rushdie, case of, this one and that one. One of the cases that horrifying, in Rwanda, a young poet, Innocent Bahati, went missing last year. And since then, we haven't heard from him. We've been campaigning for him, including so many people from Paul Auster to Margaret Atwood to Orhan Pamuk. They all help us to raise this issue. We stated so many things, so many statements published in media, and we used diplomatic channels. I don't know that poet, Innocent Bahati. I saw his pictures, and we share it, and nowadays it's on the streets of London everywhere. But every night when I go to bed, I talk with my wife. She says, is there any new case today? Every day there are so many cases. But Innocent Bahati's face always in my mind. He's like my brother, my friend. But when I'm thinking about Innocent Bahati, that means at the same time I've been thinking about 125 other cases that we've been following in last year. What can I do for someone that I don't know?
Did anyone ever help you in that same way? I mean, I know, when you came to Britain, there were probably people helping you, but when you were young, you've told a story before about Yasser Kamal calling you and saying, "Boy, come to me," and summoning you to his house to talk. Was he one of those people that sort of kind of got to you before you were at risk, or did he come to you after you had had struggles with the authorities?
With Yasser Kemal, it was after my exile, when I returned from exile, when everything already happened. But thanks to people, like us, there are wonderful organizations and people everywhere. When I was in that difficult situation, my friends were looking for somewhere that I can stay and have long-term treatment. There were two options. One was in Hamburg, in Germany. The other was in London. And the London one came earlier, and then my friend said that we should go there because I was in a very bad situation. In London, now I have to name, we have to remember names and we have to praise them. It's called Freedom from Torture Center. In the past, when I was there, it named different. It was called Medical Foundation Treatment for the Victims of Torture. I call those people there angels. Literally, they are saving lives. Now, if they hadn't been there, I think I have got committed suicide so far. Certainly, they saved my life. When I was going there, because they have a big waiting room like this, because there are so many doctors and consultants, and my doctor, he passed away. He was a very old man, Dr. John Randall. We have to praise for him. And I was waiting for John before every session. In a big room, you see about 50, 60 people. You don't speak because everybody comes from a different country. You don't have English, and you just see stories. Someone from Chile, from Iran, from Philippines, from Uganda. And you know that everyone, each of them has a story like you have your own story, a painful part of the world. How are we going to save not ourselves, this world, from this result? And this center, Freedom from Torture is one of great organizations doing great things. And as today now PEN International I'm proud of, or Amnesty International or Human Rights Watch, that kind of an organization are doing great things. Of course, many writers, intellectuals, journalists, universities, publishing houses, they are also part of this big civil, solidarity.
I wonder if we could go back to Stone and Shadow, talking about, it's the first book of yours, I think, that does not have a character contemplating suicide. It certainly comes up in Sins and Innocence because the main character there is such chronic insomnia. He thinks, if this continues, I'm going to kill myself. Which is slightly funny because we've all been there, maybe. It can get that bad. Labyrinth obviously has a failed suicide. It certainly comes up in Istanbul. And yet, in Stone and Shadow, there's some terrible things that happen. I mean, Reyhan has faces some truly terrible obstacles in her life. And I wonder if you can talk about writing a book in which, at least for me, unless I missed it, it's the first time it doesn't come up, that it's not the exit door.
Maybe it has nothing to do with my books, maybe with my state of mind as the writer of the book. Maybe I'm improving, maybe I'm getting better. I'm getting away from that sense of committing suicide. And you write things, but you don't realize what you are writing. My wife, thanks to her, she is reading everything 3, 4, 5 times, and then she, start to tell me that what I've written actually, and she said something similar. She said, "Okay, now good. You are talking about death, but not death by your hand." And I said, "Oh, okay." Then you start thinking, and then you say, "Yes, now I'm at a different stage." Now I think and I feel that, okay, I'm in a better situation now, and then it finds its place in my books. And one of the things she discovered, I have to share it here. In every book, every hero in my books, they smoke. I never smoked in my life. She said, "Are you crazy?" Then I realized, because when I was a teenager, I wanted to be a smoker. I tried many times, but I always hated it.
Didn't have the commitment.
Then, okay, I said, okay, we have to study Freud and start to understand.
Well, saying that in this city, I think there's probably 1 or 2 people in the audience. I met someone today who said, "Yes, how have you lived here and never smoked?" I wonder what it's like is this your first time in Sarajevo as an author?
In my life, first time.
First time.
I meant to come, you remember 3 years ago we tried, but it was COVID, we couldn't travel before that. I've received invitations always, but always clash with some other things. And finally now I came, but only for 1 day, because tomorrow I have to go to Italy for some other event. But I will be back soon, hopefully.
What are your, do you have any instant impressions? I mean, in some ways, Stone and Shadow is a book about the passage of time, the decline of states, the unraveling of the Ottoman Empire, and there are many traces of political and history that are both here and in your books. And do you have any first impressions about how the past feels present here in ways that are similar or different from where you call home?
Lately, in the last 4 or 5 months, I've been traveling around all these Balkan countries, from Macedonia to Romania, Serbia, around here. Every time when I go, I try to understand something I wrote in my novel, Istanbul. When I was writing Istanbul, I tried to describe the definition of time in architecture. Because traveling in time is a dream, for scientists. Can we travel in time to future or to past? But as I wrote in that novel, when we look at architecture, actually we are traveling in time. in this Başçarşıya, you say, yeah. When you travel, you know that there was something else here. Or when you go towards airport, that's, you know, tall buildings, you know, established during socialist era, and look at something and see through them the history that they've been to. And then you feel that the time is also present here. It's not only in the past, it is now here with us. I think architecture, in that sense, one of the most successful elements that humanity improved to capture the time. And when I went out with my friend Andrea, thanks to her help, and it was always in my mind, okay, this is the history. You are not seeing just the town today, you are seeing the last 100 years or 500 years, and of course you remember the books like Ivo Andrić and other books, and you see a big picture.
How do you think the novel in Turkish and Kurdish has orchestrated time versus architecture? Because it feels like each one of your books is obsessed with this in different ways, and you're looking at the passage of time from a different angle. And you mentioned at the beginning that this is sort of the modernist version of a novel, the most modernist that you've written.
I think with every novel, I'm trying to understand the other disciplines, you know, like philosophy, theology, and science, how they captured the picture of the world and give it a sense. With every novel, because a novel is not something that we can learn some. It's not a book of history. If we try to learn things from novels, that means we will end up in a wrong way, because they make things up. A work of art, not only novels in general, I think can give us not new knowledge, but a new way of looking things. It gives us a new angle. And with this book, I said, okay, which angle now I should, stand and then see the things through. And thinking about the space and time at the same time, and try to unite. In physics, that's Heisenberg's problem. The time and space cannot be captured at the same time. It's impossible. Because time is moving. When we get there, the space, and it's long things. And I said, okay, this is something physical truth in science, but in art we try to go beyond that physical boundaries. We try to unite time and space, and that's why Avdo, the main character, he is always going next to his fiance's graveyard, and he's trying to spend time next to her grave. And there, the time and the space unite in a different way. This is something can be created only in art. This is the only way to broaden our mind.
It's really romantic in a brainy way. Love is both a particle and a wave. When we met before, we saw each other about 6 weeks ago in Norway, and we were talking about going back in time, the time that you spent in prison. And when I first went to Istanbul, every writer I met, I met through Yasha Kemal. And I would, like an idiot, I just kept asking people, like, how did you meet? And they'd be like, oh, we met in prison. And then they would laugh. And they would laugh and laugh. And then they would tell stories about, like, it was basically like they'd been to a different university. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about how, in whatever way you want to describe it, incarceration changes both your sense of community and time.
Yeah, it is a cultural reality, in the land that I come from. Always being surrounded these stories of imprisonment. This is something we always feel not only normal but also proud. Oh, prison is nothing. But on the other hand, actually, it turns us into kind of monsters. Because our minds is always surrounded with violence, with the evil things, with the dark, happenings, and we are losing our normal way of being happy. This is maybe a way of survival, because we have an exact period since 1860s, exactly 160 years ago, the first arrest and exile of intellectuals started in Turkey. It was during Ottoman time, and the Sultan started to oppress writers because they started to speak against palace for the first time. And some of them were imprisoned and sent to exile. And since then, there is not a single decade that intellectuals not been imprisoned or murdered or tortured. That long history of oppression, on the other hand, of course, created its opposition, a long tradition of resistance. So we are so strong in Turkey, especially young generation, when they come and write, they always write more, let's say, blatant or sharper things, criticizing governments, authorities. We are worried about younger. We say, hey, look, we do that kind of things, but be careful, okay? You have family or you have future, but we know that they will do that kind of things because they would like to resist, that situation. How can we change this? I think in current political environment, in the near future, we cannot see any hope that things will get better. About 4 or 5 years ago, the biggest left-wing newspaper, there is a book supplement, it's Cumhuriyet newspaper. In the book supplement, the best book supplement still in Turkey, every week they publish. On one of the issues, on the cover, they said, okay, the list of writers who's been in prison in Turkey. They wrote names, like graffitis on the walls, because there was a design. Of course, names of dead writers mostly. And after that, the editor said, we received hundreds of letters and protests, say that you didn't add this. Yes, you forgot this name and my name, and of course it's a long list, And also one of chief writer, he passed away now from that newspaper. Once he wrote, he said that if you want to be a good writer, you should have studied in prison in Turkey.
As a human rights advocate, as someone involved in PEN International, I know you've got your eye on a lot of parts of the world, but sitting here as an American where we incarcerate such a large percentage of our population, I wonder what you make of countries where it's not the intellectuals and it's not the writers who are in prison, but it's people who are not culturally, who don't culturally typically have a voice, so to speak. What do you make of the jeopardy that puts a society in comparison to the one you just described?
In Beckett's play, Waiting for Godot, he says, the amount of tears in the world is always same. It doesn't change. If somewhere people stopped crying, that means in some other places people are crying, you know, and the same for the laughter he uses. I hope it was not true, you know, and we would be able to get rid of all that tears and pains in this world. But we can get something from that book, that things are changing place. Now, people are suffering in, let's say, in Myanmar, or in Ukraine, or in Palestine, you know, all around, as people suffered here 70 years ago, you know, in Europe, in, you know, during the Second World War, and maybe things will have a different place in 20 years' times. So we shouldn't see things as the problem of certain cultures, or as they part of their destiny. Oh, they come from Third World War. Oh, that's normal things that they are going through. No, this kind of things might happen at any time, anywhere. Look at this, all this nuclear power or governments, you know, holding from Trump to Putin. You know, we remember they were using that power of button under their fingers. And all this, you know, even the climate crisis now, we just forgot about it. All these, you know, big risks and dangers around us. And as a human being, we are kind of not so naive, but maybe a bit blind sometimes. We stop thinking about great dangers around us, like in that movie came, Don't Look Up. Yeah. It was very realistic, actually, you know.
I wonder, if, as we wind down here, if you could talk at the end about, you know, this book is more consistently than your others, certainly a love story. It's a series of love stories between various characters, between a man and a woman, between friends, between a child and her mother. And, you know, I don't think it strains sentimentality to say that you're trying to, seems like, find an order in the world that is driven by love, in spite of all the things we've talked about tonight. This terrible capacity we have for violence, the awful ability when we gather in groups and call them governments to oppress people within those spaces. Throughout it, the thing that is organizing the whole book are these currents of love between characters. And I wonder if you can talk about just what it was like to write the varieties of love story that power this book. Which were the easiest, which were the hardest? Any of them surprise you?
Yeah, you know, when I write, generally in most of my novels, I love writing stories within stories. And in this book, I have about 20, maybe more than 20 stories in a big frame. With each single story, I try to give a different dimension, you know, in experiencing and defining love, especially not violence or other things, but love can be experienced in 100 ways. You know, in that one of opening chapters in Anna Karenina, she was in a ball, Anna, and even though she was married, she was very much interested in discussing about love. And there was an old woman there in that hall, and she was very old and wise, everybody trusted, and she was surrounded by young girls. Everybody was asking, "Oh, madam, please tell us what love is." And her answer was wonderful. She said, "There is not a single love. In this world, how many people are, that's the number of loves. With every person, there is a different kind of love. And also for us, in our life, I don't have a single love. I now have a love that I have with my wife. But when I was young, when I was in love with someone else, it was a different kind of love. Because with that kind of relationships, two different times and space unite. And the time and space of my partner defines my current time and space. And then it makes a unique and new love. So that's why art and telling story is very important. We always read stories of love, but still we are, after reading new stories, because we know that every love is very unique, peculiar, and special. It cannot be seen in other love stories.
What an amazing way to end. BURHAN SÖNMEZ, such a pleasure. Stone and Shadow is here. Do we have time for questions? Does that happen now? Does anybody have a question for him? Is he available as an advice columnist? Dear BURHAN, I met this guy in Sarajevo at a reading. Does he love me? Amila.
Yes, I would like to ask a question. First of all, thank you so much. This was such a delightful conversation, and I think we are all a bit speechless at this moment. My question is regarding your comment about the sheer number, the mass kind of violence against the writers. Against the writers in.
You can use this one.
Yeah, against the writers, which is, yes, specific to Turkey, but it also is not. I mean, there are clearly writers elsewhere in the region, and we know under Saddam Hussein there were so many prisoners in Iraqi prisons. And the kind of perverse reading that, in fact, they understand the power of writing, so they have to put them away. They understand the power of literature. They understand the power of art. And I wonder to what extent you could comment if there is a certain perpetuation of a narrative around state-sponsored violence that those who experience violence, like yourself, can create a kind of a community. You've already addressed that, but even though people are imprisoned in different contexts, even within Turkey, like, I don't know, I'm thinking of Osman Kavala now, and completely different kind of political prisoner, but is there a particular narrative form or theme or something that you feel that those who have experienced or the writers have among each other? And if you could, in fact, comment on that.
Yeah, maybe we can see the discourse from those two parts. A writer, a poet is not an important person, in life. He or
Au contraire.
Yeah. He or she is sitting in their room and writing something romantic or powerful. They are doing something, very straightforward. But then suddenly they are being targeted by authority. They say that, oh, what are you wrote, is dangerous. And then you realize that actually I am important. I am something bigger than that, I imagine myself. This importance is given to writers by authorities, not by writers themselves. We never say that we are important people. But then government says, you are important. Oh, really? And they come to kill you or put you in prison or torture you. And this is their story. This is how they see you. But for us, I think Socrates described it in ideal way. When he was at that trial, he said, of course he was thinking about philosophers, and we can transform it to the identity of poets. He said, I am a bee, a bumblebee. I am disturbing this, big power of establishment. Yes, we are not terrorists, we are not militants, we are just disturbing the peace of those big powers, those establishments, and also giving a sense of, awakening to people. Hey, look, something is going over there. Just watch out, okay? Don't leave your power into, the hands of those people, because they are not good people. You are good, you have power, but you don't use your good and your power. And so this is the thing that we do by creating art. Art is, in that sense, cannot give us a political manifesto, but it can speak with us. It can say, hey, look, this is world, and we should have a different language, a language that other than politics.
So I think in his book Istanbul by Orhan Pamuk that he wrote that if I see, and I'm not sure if I'm quoting this right, but if I see my city as beautiful and bewitching, then my life must be so too. And I guess in his book a lot, and he's also a writer that is, I'm not really popular with the Turkish governments and politics, if I'm right, but did you ever have that experience of connecting with a city that much, since you have to, I guess, flee and run away all the time from the government? And what's even worse, you're Kurdish, so you weren't really likable. So did you ever have a city that you were in that you connected to personally on a romantic, I guess, level and on a life level?
You mean a place?
A place,
yeah.
Yes.
I think it's my village. In every novel I've written, I mentioned the Haymana Plain. Haymana Plain is a vast desert-like place in central Anatolia, in central Turkey. In the middle, you can see my small village. So we have so many Kurdish tribes there, and we live as if we are in a different universe. As John mentioned, when we had electricity in my village, I was 14 years old. When someone was coming to village, we didn't have shop. Traveling peddler sellers would come, once a month. They would sell you from clothes to, let's say, salt, everything. And in that small environment, there was another universe. And in every novel, I tried to keep that sense and mentioning the name of Haymana, and also using the language of oral literature. Of course, now we are talking about Beckett or Socrates or Kafka, Tolstoy. This is my knowledge of modern world and modern art. But the thing I try to put in is the language of my mother, which is dead now. How can we keep it alive in a modern framework? This is something I think wonderful Orhan Pamuk managed in his novels, because he used that power of old Ottoman heritage or Istanbul history in his modern stories. It was a wonderful fusion, I think. Yes, yeah, that's one of the best.
Are there other questions?
But for people...
So let's try like this. So thanks, first of all, for sharing your story, personal story, and I believe no one is coming out of the space with the same feelings and being same person as it was before this event. So thanks a lot for that. What is your explanation? How is it possible that within one human being or human mind, two things can live parallelly, and one, it is endless love toward one human being, and in parallel,
committing the act of such terrible thing as torturing? How is it possible? What is your thoughts about that?
Thank you for this question. Now, I've been now working on my first non-fiction book nowadays, which is about the metaphysics of art. Why, as human beings, we needed art. And I have a couple of editors at the University of Cambridge. We've been discussing about the same questions. Why we are like this? And one of the conclusions, we come is we are still a species in the process of evolution. We shouldn't exaggerate our state. We think that, okay, we are a human being. We are the only thinking creature in this universe. That means we are the master. But on the other hand, look at the history, the recent history. Our civilization has got, let's say, in a good sense, about 10,000 years history, or let's say 20,000. What about dinosaurs? They lived 60 million, or how many millions years? And we are still shaping, we are still learning, we are still improving ourselves. Part of us is still a wild animal. The other part is a dreamer who is watching stars every night with a dream of better future for humanity. So those two things still are together. And all these fights in political platforms or in arts or in our daily lives, in our families, is the fight of those two different parts of our evolutionary character. Are we going to train ourselves, our spirit, our soul in a better way? This is something we should try.
Another amazing note to end on. You really stuck the landing again. I could listen to you talk for hours because I think it is so refreshing to have an intellectual and far-reaching conversation about the health of the soul without touching areas that I think we don't need to explain, make us all cringe. And this novel is deeply beautiful. It's also very funny. It makes you want to love. It's out there, translated into Bosnian. Please pick it up and join me in thanking BURHAN SÖNMEZ for this wonderful evening.
Thank you, John. Thank you very much. Thank you for coming.